Hello and welcome to our Lakeside chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Chen. Chen is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
Thank you, Corinna. I would like to take a personal moment at this time to reflect on the how far we are drifting from reciprocity with the earth in both our understanding and especially in our actions, and how nature and people throughout the world are suffering as a result. And I would also like to express my hope that programs and the wonderful researchers that are here tonight, especially Emily, are building and keeping that knowledge that's going to be important for reconnections and establishing reciprocity. So I want to say that, and I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. We have a wonderful program planned, and before I turn it over to Emily, I want to mention a few things about our organization. Okay, so we are Rotary Nature Center Friends, a nonprofit, independent organization at Lake Merritt. And we are not part of the city. We're not part of the Rotary Nature Center that is operated by the Parks and Rec department. A focus of our activities have been for the last 3 years since we incorporated our community science and environmental justice. So in the realm of community science, we do water testing, plankton monitoring, and biodiversity monitoring, and in each case involving local people, especially young people, in collecting information and evaluating it and sharing it with the scientific community. We build community and understanding of the natural world we live in through serving all ages. Many of the local people in both public and private schools, primarily kids of color who are at Lake Merritt, seeking recreation, education, and understanding. And we were working with organizations like New Voices Are Rising, Youth Employment Partnership, the Lake Merritt Breakfast Club, and the Elks in providing these activities for people at Lake Merritt. So here like to share our board. We have collected together a group of people with varied backgrounds and areas of expertise, with people who have experience with naturalist interpretation at some of the most prominent museums in California. We have educators, we have scientists, we have artists, and we feel very privileged to have these folks join us in producing our programs, both this online chat, but also many in-person programs. Briefly, I'd like to share two big projects that we've launched recently. We are collecting, we have equipped ourselves with a professional instrument so that we can do water testing and share that information with the community and with water boards. And we're very happy to have their support on that. And we also have been following, of course, the salmon. And that salmon project is the topic of our talk tonight. So want to highlight a recent activity. We participated in the Geological Society of America's southwestern section, the Cordilleran section, in a session at their convention in Sacramento, organized by Andrew Alden, who you see here, and by Jerry Lips, who is I think here today as well. We were able to bring some of the naturalists from Lake Merritt, Jim Covell, whose father was the original supervising naturalist, and of course Jerry Lips, who has studied the geology and the biology of Lake Merritt. And we brought a number of young people who had participated in collecting the information displayed on our posters. So it was really a fun event, and we had a great time. We also wanted to share that we have been out in the field. This is some pictures of our visit to a local school, young people. We brought Lake Merritt to them since they couldn't come to the lake, with a series of interactive lessons that we bring into the schools. So we would like to thank everybody who contributes, both financially and also in terms of their knowledge and their time to our programs. And with that, I am going to stop my share, and we will introduce our speaker, Emily Chen. So it was just, we've been following, as an organization, Rotary Nature Center Friends has been following the appearance of Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt for probably 3 years, at least, maybe 4 years. When we first saw them, we didn't know what they were. We didn't know what we would be permitted to do to try to find out about them. And so it was with really great excitement that I learned about Emily's work, looking at the native Chinook salmon in the Central Valley and in California and other locations. She got her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to that, I believe she had experience working in salmon monitoring organizations. Help me out, Emily, if I forget some details here, but she's a salmon biologist from way back. She's from Minnesota, am I correct?
Wisconsin.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
From
that was a good
Wisconsin. Okay, so I have my
close.
notes here, but I'm not reading them. Okay. So anyways, she came out to California for school, and became involved in trying to untangle and understand this amazing group of species on our planet that is going about doing its thing, despite us having, really beaten it back nearly to extinction by our activities. let's see. So Emily is currently a a at the salmon wild salmon center as a conservation fellow. And she'll probably share with you some of her work there. And she's been wonderful in answering questions, and we've been in conversation. I have so many questions, and there's so much I don't know. Emily, we're so privileged to have you here tonight. Did I leave out something that you would like to add as background?
No, that's about it. I have a little bit of background information in my slides. Yeah, thanks, Katie, for having me, and thank you, everybody, for joining in today for this presentation. Just a little bit of additional information about me. As Katie mentioned, I'm a conservation research fellow at the Wild Salmon Center. It's an organization that's based in Portland, focused on conserving salmon populations all across the Pacific Ocean. So from North America and all the way into Russia and Mongolia as well. I just finished my PhD last fall at UC Berkeley, working with Dr. Stephanie Carlson, and my research has been focused on during my PhD has been focused on Chinook salmon in California, specifically in the Central Valley, looking at their life history and also their population dynamics. And so some of my research focuses on during my PhD and now have been looking at Chinook salmon population trends over time, especially in California, and looking at how different human activity and need for resources have impacted Chinook salmon, and how the climate and the environment also affect salmon populations as well. And ultimately, the goal of understanding the salmon population trends and how they're affected by the environment is to develop strategies for managing and restoring salmon populations, and also balancing our socioeconomic needs for water and other resources as well. But why we're really here today is to talk about Chinook salmon and them being in Lake Merritt. So as Katie mentioned, they were spotted in Lake Merritt this fall, and that this has been occurring in the last few years, and has been starting to increase since they've been showing up in 2021. And so there's really a question around where these fish came from, and why they're in the lake. And that's something we're hoping to learn more about. And that's something that as they come back year to year, maybe we can do more research to understand where they come from. So things that I want to talk today before we dive into Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt itself. I just want to give some background information on Pacific salmon in general, and talk about, since these are Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt, talk about the history of Chinook salmon in California and in the Central Valley, and how they're doing right now, before we go into what could be happening in Lake Merritt. So first, I kind of want to just highlight some key unique traits about Pacific salmon. They're really special fishes and have a lot of unique traits that make them different from a lot of species of fish. One term that I wanted to share is that they're anadromous. And so what that means is that they have both a freshwater and a marine component of their life cycle. So salmon, when they spawn in freshwater, so they come in from the ocean and they spawn typically in rivers, and the eggs are laid in the gravel in the river, and they incubate there until the eggs hatch, and the fish spend some amount of time in the river before they're ready to head back out to the ocean, but they really spend a lot of their time in the ocean growing and getting big before they come back again to freshwater to spawn. Another important trait about Pacific salmon is that they're semiparous. And so what this means is that they only spawn a single time in their lifetime. So after they spawn, they die. And so a lot of other fish species, they might spawn multiple times before they're in their lifetime. But what's really unique about salmon is that they only spawn a single time. So they only have one shot to reproduce. Another unique trait about Pacific salmon is that they exhibit something called homing. And so what that means is that they return back to the river that they're born in. And so this is a really special trait because it means when they're hatching, they're imprinting on the river in which they were born in. And when they head out to the ocean, they know exactly where to come back. Sometimes they come back to the exact same reach in which they were born. And this is really important because what this means is that fish from different rivers are actually reproductively isolated from each other, even though they're very close and maybe in the ocean they mix. When they come back to their same river, and so each of the rivers can be quite genetically distinct. And then lastly, what's interesting about Pacific salmon is that they're considered to be pretty short-lived. And so once they mature at age, sometime between ages 2 to 5, typically, they die. So they have a pretty short lifespan, especially if you think about how big salmon can get. And you think about like other species of fish, like rockfish can live anywhere between 30 to 70 years and grow to that size. And so it's pretty incredible that salmon can grow to such a big size at such a young age. This was a trivia question, but we'll talk a little bit about this more. We consider on the North American side there to be 5 species of Pacific salmon, and there are ocean-going trout, but they're, I guess, just colloquially referred to as trout. And so we think of there being 5 species of salmon on the North America side. And so there's Chinook salmon, which are also known as king salmon. There's sockeye salmon, which are known as red salmon. And so all these salmon species actually have multiple names. And so pink salmon are also known as humpies because the males get these like hump-shaped backs when they mature. Coho salmon are also known as silver salmon. And then there's also chum salmon, which are also known as dog salmon. And in California, we primarily have 2 different species of salmon that we can find. You can actually find the other 3 species in certain pockets or on rare occasions, but Chinook salmon and coho salmon are the 2 main species of salmon that we're going to have in California. And they're pretty different. They live in different places. So Chinook salmon or king salmon are typically found in large river basins and in large rivers, whereas coho salmon are mostly found in tributaries of these rivers or in small coastal rivers. Chinook salmon, when they're born, typically in California, spend less than a year in fresh water before they head out to the ocean. Compared to coho salmon, they actually spend over a year in fresh water before they migrate to the ocean. In California, Chinook salmon, there are some populations of Chinook salmon that are considered to be endangered or threatened, but there's also some that are not listed. Whereas for coho salmon, all coho salmon in California are listed as threatened or endangered. And then lastly, Chinook salmon are king salmon, so they're really the largest species of salmon, and these fish typically come back at ages 2 through 5, but sometimes they can come back at even older ages. Whereas coho salmon, they have a much more rigid age structure. They typically come back at age 2 and age 3, so they're going to be a little bit smaller than king salmon when they come back. I have some maps here just showing the distribution of these two species in California. So on the left, there's coho salmon, and the purple is just showing where you can find them here on the central part of the coast. And you can see that they're mostly in these small coastal tributaries or these small coastal rivers along the coast. And so in the Bay Area, this includes Lagunitas Creek and San Geronimo Creek in Marin County, and then also in Santa Cruz, there's Scotts Creek and Russian River. These are the rivers around this area that have coho salmon. And then for Chinook salmon, I show the range here, and you can see that they occupy much larger rivers. So the Sacramento and all of its tributaries, such as the Yuba River, the American, the Feather, all these different rivers host Chinook salmon. They can also see them in the Russian River and the Eel River, but you're going to find them in these larger rivers compared to coho salmon. So the state of salmon in California is pretty depressed. So coho salmon, as I mentioned earlier, all coho salmon in California are listed. So in Central California, in the Bay Area, they're all considered to be endangered. And then in the northern part of the state, they are listed as threatened. For Chinook salmon, on the other hand, there are 4 different types of Chinook salmon that you'll find in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of them is listed as endangered. That's winter run Chinook salmon, and we'll talk about the different runs a little bit. Spring run is also listed as threatened, but fall run and late fall run fish are not listed in the Central Valley. And then Chinook salmon found elsewhere, not in the San Francisco Bay Area, so along rivers along the coast, are all listed as threatened. So there's a lot of salmon that are imperiled here in California. In the salmon field, we have something that we refer to as the 4 H's of salmon decline, and these are 4 key factors that have impacted salmon populations, and all of them exist in California. And so one of the 4 H's is habitat loss and degradation, and this includes things that happen historically, like mining and river dredging, but also things that are happening present day, such as logging, which has happened historically, but also is happening today. Water diversions, and also levees in the Delta region. And then habitat loss isn't just things that are happening immediately in the river, but things that are happening on land and terrestrially could also affect and result in habitat loss for salmon. So if you think logging, for example, logging is going to remove trees which hold soil. So this leads to greater erosion, and this erosion can lead to more landslides that can clog up the rivers. And so things that happen on land could also be affecting things that are happening, can also have impacts on the river as well. Another H that's part of the salmon decline is harvest, and this is pretty obvious that immediately harvest and impacts fish populations. And harvest was especially great in this area in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. There were a lot of canneries in San Francisco, in the Delta, and Sacramento that were harvesting Chinook salmon as they were coming back. And a lot of these canneries were quickly built up in the late 1800s and then eventually crashed in the early 1900s after the populations were decimated by harvest and also habitat destruction. And harvest is still happening today, in the river and also in the ocean, and impacts the population, but it's at a much smaller volume because the populations are much lower now. Another H of the 4 H's is hydropower and just need for water. So here I just have a map of the Central Valley of California, and on the right there is these squares that indicate dams that block passage for fish to spawn. And you can see that these dams have blocked a lot of these upper headwaters of the Sierras. And this is typically where salmon in the past have spawned. And so these hydropower dams have blocked a lot of passage to where fish go to reproduce. And then lastly, hatcheries might not seem as intuitive as they're producing fish, why they would lead to salmon declines, but there's a lot of evidence of mass production of fish can impact wild populations through competition and also inbreeding between hatchery and wild fish. And we'll go into that a lot more in detail in a bit. So that was kind of depressing. When I practiced this presentation, I thought I should have a little bit of a positive note at the end after talking about the 4 H's. And we have something also in our field that we refer to as the 4 C's of salmon recovery. And so these are 4 principles that we are thinking about when it comes to restoring these populations and thinking about what salmon need for recovery. And so what they need is complex and dynamic habitats like they experience historically and are adapted to, connected habitats, and this includes connecting the river to the floodplain. It also means connecting rivers from upstream to downstream, clean rivers. That's pretty straightforward. And then also cold rivers as well. And so salmon here in California are at the very southern end of their range. And so they're pretty cold water species, and that's only going to get more challenging with climate change. Another positive note, and I think overall there's a lot of great success stories that are happening in salmon conservation, but a huge success story in the last year has been the Klamath Dam removals. This is in the northern part of our state, and this has been deemed the largest dam removal in the history of the world. And this just happened last year. There were 4 dams that were removed on the Klamath River that were primarily used for hydroelectricity. And this was really an important grassroots movement that was led by tribes in the area, including the Yurok and the Kru tribe. All 4 dams came out after decades of campaigning to remove these dams, and they finally came out last year. There's a lot of cool videos of these dams coming out that I encourage you to take a look at. And they surveyed the rivers upstream of the dams after they were removed last year, and they estimate that about 1,500 salmon came up and spawned above where those dams were taken out. So we're already seeing really big successes from this huge restoration project. So that's in the northern part of the state, but today we're kind of focused on where we are here, which is part of this greater watershed known as the California Central Valley. This area is actually made up of 2 river basins. So we have the Sacramento River Basin, which runs from Redding down into Sacramento, and then also the San Joaquin Basin, which starts roughly around the Fresno area and runs northwards towards the Delta. And these 2 rivers come together in the Sacramento Delta before going through the San Francisco Bay and out through the Golden Gate. And this basin area covers actually a huge part of our state. So you can imagine from the Sierras all the way to the coast, and then from Redding to Fresno. So this is a really large part of our state. It's a really important source of water for us as well. And so there's a lot of infrastructure in this basin that's meant for extracting water. So you can think of dams that are used for water storage, water diversions, levees to prevent flooding, and then a lot of also introduced species in this area too. What's really unique about this basin is that there are 4 different types of Chinook salmon that you can find here, which is really special, and I'll go in a little bit into that now. So as I just mentioned, there is 4 different types of Chinook salmon that you can find in the Central Valley. And I think this is really fascinating and why I wanted to study Chinook salmon here for my PhD, because we're at the southern range of the species. And so Chinook salmon can be found anywhere from Alaska to California here. So we're at the very edge of their range. And so I was expecting that, at the southern end of their range to maybe not find, as much different populations of Chinook salmon, but it's actually the exact opposite. We have a huge radiation of Chinook salmon here. And I think that really speaks to how complex and how fascinating this basin is and how many different habitats and ecological niches there are. And also it speaks to how salmon have been able to adapt and fill all these different niches. And so these 4 different runs of Chinook salmon, they're named after the season in which they come back to spawn. They spawn in different parts of the river and at different times of the year. So there's actually no overlap in terms of their reproduction. And so these are 4 isolated runs of salmon that are occurring in this basin. And so we have winter run and spring run. These are fish that come in early in the season, and they come in when the water is quite warm, but they head straight up to the headwaters and the Sierra streams that stay pretty cold and are able to spawn high up in the mountains, typically when it's warmer, but the mountain water stays pretty cold during the summertime. And then we have fall run and late fall fish, which typically spawn further down in the basin. They're spawning in the valley, and so they're coming in right when the water levels begin to rise in the river, and they're coming in and laying their eggs pretty quickly before they die. And so here I just have just a couple of different facts, and you can just see that they come back at different times of year. They spend different amounts of time in fresh water before they head out, and they also come back at different ages. So there's really a lot of diversity, and there's limited overlap between these different runs, which I think is really fascinating. So the Central Valley, it's really important to our state right now. It's really important to salmon, but it's also been really important to the history of our state and why California, has been so economically prosperous since it formed as a state. When California was first established as a state, a lot of the economy boom was due to the natural resources in this area, especially in the Central Valley. And so the gold rush that happened in the mid 1800s was a huge, economic start to the state. And initially, a lot of mining that was happening in the river, but as gold began running out in the river itself, people began blasting the mountainside to extract gold. And so I have a picture here of an example of hydraulic mining, which is basically when people are blasting the mountainside with water at high power and leading to the mountain being broken down, and a lot of the rubble and the sand a lot of it is dumped into the river to extract gold, and this essentially destroyed a lot of habitat that salmon used to spawn. Salmon canneries at the same time, happening roughly at the same time in the Delta area, were also capturing a lot of these fish that were coming back to spawn. And so not only were fish being harvested, but for the fish that did make it back to the river to spawn, a lot of their habitat had been destroyed by mining. So both of these two things together really led to a decline in salmon populations during this era. There were also levees that were constructed in the Delta during this period to prevent flooding to agriculture and to establish agricultural fields. This has been also really important for our state too, but it's also really limited the habitat for salmon, because this area, typically in the Delta, has been a place where juvenile salmon grow and get really big so they can survive in the ocean. And so this has been another piece of habitat that was lost for human use. So that was a little bit about the history of the Central Valley, but there's still a lot of human activity and needs that we have in this system that are impacting salmon populations. And so, number one issue is in California is water, and a lot of infrastructure in this system meant for us to extract water. So this includes dams and reservoirs to store water, flood control and levees to prevent water from flooding agricultural fields and cities, and then also water diversions to pump water beyond the river. And so there's a lot of water diversion in the Sacramento area meant to send water to the outer parts of the state. And a lot of these sites are where water is being pumped is a huge source of mortality for juvenile fish as they're heading out to the ocean. So I have a picture here of a water diversion site and where water is being pumped. And you can see that there's just a bunch of birds kind of in the background here that are picking up salmon as they're getting pushed down through the pumps. So how does Lake Merritt fit into all of this in the Central Valley? So Lake Merritt is considered an estuary. It's part of the San Francisco Bay estuary, and it's along the migratory corridor of Chinook salmon that are heading back to the Central Valley. So Chinook salmon that are heading through the Central Valley, they come in through the Golden Gate and they're swimming through San Pablo Bay, and there's also Lake Merritt here in the San Francisco Bay that Chinook salmon have ended up in. So just a little bit of background on the Chinook salmon that we're seeing in Lake Merritt. So they've been spotted live in Lake Merritt, which is considered an estuary. And there were a lot of live individuals that were spotted, but ultimately 29 carcasses were recovered by Rotary Nature Center friends. And they identified of these 29 individuals that 17 of them were males and 12 of them were females, and that 5 of them had their adipose fins clipped, which indicates that they are of hatchery origin. And I'll go into that a little bit. These fish were spotted in the range of October to January. A lot of them were spotted in November and December, and this is typically when fall run Chinook salmon come back in from the ocean. So most of these fish are most likely part of the fall run Chinook salmon, which is one of the non-listed runs of salmon in the Central Valley. So as I mentioned here, 5 of the fish had adipose fin clips, which indicates that they're of hatchery origin. And so what are hatcheries? And so hatcheries are facilities that take adult salmon that are ready to spawn, and they spawn the fish and raise the eggs in captivity. And actually, when the fish hatch, they raise them until they are a large enough size to be released into the wild, and they release them in the wild and let them complete the rest of their life cycle in the wild. This is really common. These hatcheries are really common in California, partially because there's a lot of dams in California. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of dams have prevented fish from being able to access their spawning habitat. So a lot of these hatcheries are typically built near the dam location. And so when fish are coming back to spawn, they actually just take the fish into the facility and spawn them there instead of in the wild. Let's see what else it had. What else? These facilities, though, however, there's a lot of evidence that the hatchery production process can have a lot of unintended side effects. One of the things being that these fish that are raised in captivity are often less fit fit than fish that are raised in the wild. And you can imagine that they're being fed on a regular basis rather than having to find their own food. They're also raised in pretty cramped conditions or pretty high dense conditions. So there's a higher chance of disease, a disease outbreak, and a lot of fish getting infected. And if these fish that are infected are released into the wild, they also have the chance of infecting natural born fish. When these fish are released in the wild, there's also the chance that they will be competitors against wild fish and eat food that other wild fish would have otherwise have eaten. And then since they're being raised in captivity and they're fed differently from fish that are in the wild, there's also the possibility that they could have behavioral differences. They're also raised in cramped conditions, whereas typically salmon in the wild are actually quite territorial as juveniles. And then most importantly, an important consideration is that if there's any genetic artificial selection that happens in the hatchery, or if there's any maladaptive genes that occur in the hatchery and these hatchery fish go to the wild and spawn with wild fish, there's the threat that could compromise the genetic integrity of wild populations. As I said earlier, these hatcheries are really common in California. So here I just have a map of where different hatcheries are in the state. There's a lot of trout hatcheries, but pay attention to the purple ones, the salmon and the steelhead hatcheries. Most of them are along the Central Valley here, where the dams are. But there's also a couple along the coast in the Russian River and in the Mad River. I just want to point out that there's different types of hatcheries, and hatcheries can serve different purposes. And so some hatcheries we refer to them as production hatcheries, and their main goal is to produce fish for harvest. So it's a lot of these hatcheries are mass producing fish and releasing tens of millions of fish every year for people to harvest in the ocean or in the river. And there's evidence of artificial selection happening in these hatcheries because of how mass-produced these fish are. I also want to point out, however, that there's conservation hatcheries, and these are hatcheries that are created to recover endangered or threatened populations. And so these hatcheries typically release far fewer numbers of fish to not overwhelm the natural population. There's also a lot more effort and money put into selecting the adults that are used to spawn. So there's a lot of genetic testing to ensure that the fish have good genetic integrity. There's not inbreeding that's happening. And so just keep in mind that there's different types of hatcheries and they have different goals and they might have different impacts on populations. One important practice or issue I wanted to mention was trucking of hatchery fish. And so fish, they are born, in the river, and once they begin their migration, they have to travel quite a while until they reach the ocean. And so a fish that's born in Redding, in the Sacramento River near Redding, has to travel a couple hundred miles before it reaches the Delta and the Bay. And so along the way, a lot of fish die during their migration process. A lot of them are eaten by other fish, especially a lot of non-native predators such as bass in this area. There's also times and years where the temperature in the river is pretty high, especially during drought years, and the flows are very low, and this can lead to poor conditions and lead to fish getting weak and ultimately not surviving or getting eaten more quickly because of that. And so the migration process is actually a huge source of mortality for these fish, and it's especially worsening with climate change in drought years. And so what trucking is essentially is trying to bypass this stage of mortality. And so a lot of hatcheries, instead of releasing fish in the river where they're from will actually bring the fish down into the bay or even to the ocean and release them there. And the goal there is to avoid this high mortality during outmigration, and it does increase the survival rate of fish and increase their rate of return. However, there's been evidence of negative consequences of this practice too. And so as I mentioned earlier, fish are when they're raised in the river, they actually imprint on the water that they were born in, and when they're out migrating, they actually imprint on the water as they're moving downstream. And so when they don't have this time and process to imprint on the river, they actually have a high rate of straying, which basically means they're lost, and so they can't go back to the river in which they were born in, and so they find somewhere else to spawn, and we refer to this as straying. And so some of the consequences that we've found from this trucking and this straying process is more interbreeding with natural populations. So these hatchery fish, if they're not imprinting on the hatchery water, they'll actually go elsewhere and interbreed with natural populations. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these rivers are these fish are reproductively isolated, and so this breeding is actually leading to more genetic exchange than what would happen naturally. And these rivers that used to be more independent from each other are now suddenly more homogeneous and less unique. One example that I want to point out, though, maybe a more positive case of hatchery production is happening in Poudre Creek. And so Poudre Creek is located near the Davis area. And historically, they don't think that there were actually salmon in Poudre Creek. And for those that are familiar with Lake Berryessa and Monticello Dam, that's Lake Berryessa flows down into Poudre Creek, or it was formed by a dam that was put on Poudre Creek. And the creation of these dams on Poudre Creek actually led to the creek running dry in a lot of years. And so there was a lot of litigation around the creeks running dry, and ultimately this led to the Poudre Creek Accord, which requires water that isn't being used to be released into the river, and that the water being released to be released in a way that imitates the natural flow of the river. And since this has been happening, there's been an increased presence of native fish species in this river. They've also found more birds coming to this river after this natural flow has been reestablished. And since 2014, they've actually seen Chinook salmon in Poudre Creek. And most recently, there's been a study in Poudre Creek showing that, well, at first, a lot of the fish that were spawning in Poudre Creek were from hatchery strays. There's now evidence of these hatchery fish actually successfully reproducing, and that those juvenile descendants are actually successfully completing the life cycle and coming back to Poudre Creek. And so this is like a really interesting story about hatchery strays potentially actually jump-starting a new population in a creek that previously did not have salmon. Chinook salmon that are released are typically there's a lot of monitoring that goes around these hatchery fish that when they're released, and so one of the ways in which they monitor these hatchery fish after they're released is that they'll remove or clip the adipose fin. So this is a small fin that's located on the back of the fish. It's pretty small, and when it's removed, it doesn't actually affect the survival rate of the fish, and so it's an easy way of marking the fish and showing that this fish is of hatchery origin. In most parts of California and at most hatcheries, they clip about 25% of the hatchery fish before they're released. And so if you see that it's a clip, you know that it came from a hatchery. And a lot of these fish, when they're clipped, they're also implanted with a coated wire tag or a batch tag on their nose. So that's what this picture is here. It's this tiny tag that goes on the nose, and it has a number. And if you look up that number, it'll tell you which hatchery this fish came from, where it was released, when it was released, when it was born, and it gives you a lot of information about this fish if it was recovered in a later part of its life. So these tags are a really important resource for managers and scientists that are studying these hatchery fish and the fate of these fish. And so there's a lot of infrastructure designed to try to recover these fish, wherever they may end up. And so if salmon are harvested in the ocean and they have a clipped fin, like in this gigantic salmon here, we could actually find the tag on its head and actually locate which hatchery it came from. And this is a program that's happening all along the coast. So if this fish was harvested in British Columbia or even up in Alaska, we can actually find its tag and find that it came all the way from California. Or if we capture a fish here, we might find out that it actually came from Washington. So it's a really useful tool and system in place. There's also the chance that these fish could end up in a river and are spawning on spawning grounds. And so there's a lot of spawning surveys that happen in these different rivers, and they recover these tags, and they're also used to understand where hatchery fish go to reproduce as well. And sometimes they end up in unexpected places. For example, in Lake Merritt. Lake Merritt doesn't have a population of Chinook salmon, so it's really interesting that they showed up here. And it's also interesting that some of them had clipped fins and are from hatcheries, and we can use these fish to understand where these fish came from. So for the Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt, as we mentioned earlier, 5 of them had their adipose fins clipped, showing that these fish did come from hatcheries. And the Rotary Nature Center friends took all the fish heads from all of the carcasses and sent them to CDFW. And CDFW took a look at the fish that had clipped fins and looked for the presence of a tag. And for the 5 fish that had clipped fins, 4 of them had a tag in them, and they were all from the same hatchery, the McCullummy River fish hatchery. CDFW also extracted otoliths from the heads of these fish too, and I'll go into a little bit about what we can learn from these otoliths. But first, information on the coated wire tags. So all 4 of the fish that had tags were from the same hatchery, the McCullummy River hatchery. This is a hatchery here on the McCullummy River, which is inland near Lodi. And what's interesting about all of these fish is that they were all released in San Francisco Bay. So they were trucked to San Francisco Bay and released in Fort Baker near Sausalito. So they were not released on site in the river. They were released in the bay. What's also interesting is that they didn't all come from the same year class. So 3 of them were born in 2021. So these were 3-year-old fish. But one fish was a year younger. It was released a year later and younger. And this fish was a 2-year-old fish. So we know that among the 29 carcasses that were recovered, that 5 of them had their fins clipped, so they were hatchery origin. But what about the remaining 24 individuals? So as I mentioned earlier, about 25% of fish from hatcheries have their fins clipped. And so what that means is that for every fish that was recovered with a clipped fin, there is we estimate there's about 3 fish for each one that is unclipped and untagged. So for the 5 fish that were clipped, that would be approximately 15 fish in this sample that were unclipped and untagged. And so what this means is that there's the possibility that some of these fish were not from a hatchery and that they were actually born in a natural river, but came to Lake Merritt. So one of the tools that we could use to better understand where these fish came from are the otoliths that were collected from these fish. And so these otoliths are ear bones that are located inside the head of a fish that were extracted from the fish after they died. And what's really unique and interesting and valuable about these otoliths is that they can give us a lot of information on the history of an individual. So these otoliths actually grow proportionately to the size of the fish. And so you can actually measure an otolith and know how big a fish was during that period of its life. What's also interesting is that these otoliths grow on a daily basis. So kind of like how a tree grows and how how foresters measure tree rings to understand the size and growth of a tree, we can do the same thing, but with these ear bones to understand its growth and its age, and we can count the rings to know how old a fish was during its given period of life. And then what's really valuable about these otoliths is that as they grow, they incorporate the water chemistry of the surrounding environment. So if a fish moves from one habitat to another with different water chemistries, we can actually detect that along the otoliths. So here I just have a picture of a sample of an otolith under a microscope, and if we measure the chemistry of the otolith along from the center, from the core of the otolith outwards, we can actually detect when the fish moved from the main part of the river into the Sacramento Delta and when it moved into the bay and into the ocean as well. And so this is a really valuable tool in terms of retracing the steps of an individual when we have their otoliths. What's really fascinating about using otoliths in California is that California has a really diverse geology. And so what that means is that the water chemistries in all these different rivers have different geology and resulting isotopic landscape. And so this allows us to measure the chemistry of the otolith at different points and actually have not only know when it went from freshwater to the ocean, but actually know where in the state or where in the basin a fish was during its period of life. So here in this figure, in this graph here, I just have all the different rivers in the Central Valley. So for example, this is like Battle Creek and Deer Creek and Mill Creek, Feather River, Stanislaus, McCollum, Tuolumne, Yuba, Merced, and American River. You can see that all these different rivers have different isotopic or strontium isotopic chemistry. So we can measure the isotope ratios in these otoliths and actually pinpoint where and in which river in particular an individual came from. And this could be useful and used for these fish in Lake Merritt to find out where they originated from. So aside from where they came from, another key question is what were they doing in the lake? And it's still a mystery that I think everyone is really interested in learning about. But just from my conversations with Katie, there's a few things that stuck out to me that I think point in the direction of what they might be doing there. One piece of evidence that she shared is that a lot of these fish fish were found closer to on the upper arms of the lake near the creek inlets. And what this suggests to me is that they were looking for fresh water to spawn, or they were attracted to finding fresh water. However, these creeks have culverts in order to move from the lake into the creek, and traditionally these culverts are considered to be pretty difficult for salmon to move into and to traverse. And not only are these culverts difficult to access, but there's a lot of limited habitat upstream of the lake, a lot of limited freshwater habitat for these fish to spawn. And so for these reasons, I don't think that these fish successfully spawned when they came into Lake Merritt, or if they tried to move into the creeks. Another piece of evidence that Katie shared with me is that some of these carcasses during the dissections had eggs and milt in them, so they had begun the process of maturation and maturing. So these are fish that were adults coming back, beginning the maturation process and starting to develop their spawning physique, I guess. However, some of them did not have eggs or milt in them, and so this suggests that these fish are just beginning their maturation process. And I didn't hear that there was any spawning behavior or activities that were observed. And when I looked at pictures of the carcasses, it doesn't look like there's been any indicator of spawning has happened. So typically, females, when they begin spawning and they dig their nest, they actually use their tails to dig a nest, and just kicking up the rocks and stuff actually causes them to lose scale and skin on their tails. So you can tell a female has spawned when you can see a white tail. It's like missing flesh on its tail, and we didn't see that in the females. And so all of this leads me to think that these fish didn't have any spawning activity when they came into Lake Merritt. And then lastly, Katie and I have talked about just the connectivity and the accessibility of this lake. So was the tide gate open? It seems that the gates were open most of the time, so fish had the ability to move in and out. We don't know if fish had the ability to move in and out, whether they were ultimately able to, and whether these fish that died in the lake were trying to move up, or if they were trying to move out. We don't necessarily know. And it's also possible that a lot more fish than the ones that were recovered did enter the lake, and maybe some of them left. So we also don't know. Maybe a lot more fish were there, and some of them maybe tried to swim up and then didn't realize it wasn't a viable option and left. So that's also a possibility that we don't know at the moment. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'm curious to hear what other thoughts people might have, but I'll just share some concluding thoughts that the reasons why we're seeing more salmon in Lake Merritt are not completely known. It's possible that the estuary conditions are now more optimal in Lake Merritt, or there's more freshwater flow that's attracting salmon to come to Lake Merritt to spawn. It's also possible that there's more straying that's happening from the hatcheries. So in the last decade, we've seen a lot more drought conditions and a lot more hatcheries releasing fish in the bay and in the ocean, and this could lead to more strays to other parts of the river. Another theory that I have is that it's possible that when these fish were released in Sausalito, they might have come to Lake Merritt as juveniles and imprinted on Lake Merritt as juvenile fish. So it's possible that when these fish were released, they maybe weren't ready to go out into the ocean, and so they actually hung out in the bay and potentially hung out near Lake Merritt and ultimately imprinted on the lake. That that would be something that would be interesting to explore. But ultimately, there's right now a very limited ability for salmon coming into Lake Merritt to spawn. So salmon need fresh water for their eggs to survive, and so they need to find completely fresh water and spawning habitat and rocks that are the sufficient size for them to build their nest. And there's limited spawning upstream of Lake Merritt for that right now. And there's as I mentioned at the beginning, there's kind of an increasing presence of Chinook salmon in Lake Merritt, and so there's a lot of patterns that we could look at to look at their timing of their arrival, what the conditions are in the lake, whether there's different patterns that lead to a greater number of salmon coming, and then also the state of the tide gate, whether it's open or closed, and whether what the salinity is of the lake at the time when these fish are coming. So that's all I have to talk about. I just want to thank the Rotary Nature Center friends and Katie for having me a part of this effort and talking about all of this information and sharing this information with me. Also want to thank CDFW. They're the ones that are tagging all these fish at the hatcheries before they're released and processing all the fish that are recovered and specifically processing the coded wire tags and the otoliths that were collected from these fish. And I understand there's a lot of volunteers and scientists and students especially that have been a part of finding and dissecting these salmon carcasses. So I just want to thank them for being part of the investigative process as well.
We do have a couple of end of program slides. Emily, if you want to, can you stop sharing? Yeah. Okay. And then I'm going to take really just a few minutes to do our end of program. And then if it's okay with you, Emily, can we begin the Q&A right after in about 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, great. So I am going to share. Okay. Yeah, I wanted to share this. This was our poster from the that we shared at the GSA, and it was based on many students and adults around Lake Merritt. We have a box here, the eyes on Lake Merritt, and really this whole wonderful question and its development would never have happened with all the wonderful people in Oakland who kept their eyes on the lake and found the carcasses. And special shout out to Emily and to Dr. Dylan Stompf at the CDFW for helping us. So want to thank everybody for coming and hope that you will return in May. Some things don't get done in a timely fashion. Okay. Okay, so special thanks to everybody who has been involved in our project that we've been discussing tonight. And coming up on Friday, May 3rd, our next Lakeside Chat will be 50 years of naturalist program at Lake Merritt, featuring naturalist James Covell, the son of the first naturalist Paul Covell at Oakland. So that will have some old photos that will be fascinating. We are going to be celebrating Earth Day on April 19th with cleanup and plant ID, plankton, water testing, all of the fun things at the lake. On April 27th, we will have a table at Lake Merritt to help people and participate in the California Academy City Nature Challenge. So more on that will be posted on our website. And then, of course, everyone wants to know, when are we going to dissect the salmon for the public? And that is still to be determined, but may happen soon as we have a backlog of them to dissect and get the otoliths out of. Okay, If you enjoy what we do, please consider making a donation to Rotary Nature Center Friends. We have a donation button on our website, and all of these projects are done by our staff and volunteers for free, but some of the things do require money. If we do pursue analysis of our salmon otoliths, that will take some support from the public, and we will accept donations specifically just for that. Okay, moving onward. Lakeside chats, such as the one you heard today, are rebroadcast by the City of Oakland on the KTOP Channel 10 TV every Sunday evening from 6 to 7 p.m. This one will be shown at the end of May. However, there will be, I'm sorry, at the end of April. But currently, there are some of the golden oldies are being shown. Okay, we will continue with this. I want to thank Rob Limon, our producer. Myself, Katie, and David Wofford are our co-chairs. And I want to thank our board members for all their help and participation, Betsy for her help tonight. And I think we are reaching the end of these slides I wanted to share with you tonight. We wanted to share to thank all of the people who are giving both their time and when they can, their support to our program. So I'm going to stop my share right now. And thank you so much for coming and for your attention. Now we are going to turn it back over to Emily and to your questions. We had a question long ago from Anthony about what species of salmon are farm raised, and is that a problem?
The most common species that is salmon that's farm raised is Atlantic salmon, and this is because salmon farming originated in Northern Europe and in Scandinavia. And there are salmon farms on the west coast of North America, up in Seattle area, and those are also Atlantic salmon as well. So most salmon that you find that's farm raised is going to be Atlantic salmon.
Can they interbreed with Chinook if they escape?
No, they can't, which I think is, which maybe is part of the reason or a beneficial reason why there's Atlantic salmon that are being reared instead of Pacific salmon. And they're actually part of a different genus, and so they're more distantly related, Atlantic salmon are.
We have a related question. Is there any species of Pacific salmon that is closest to the Atlantic?
Not any species in particular. So Pacific salmon and also rainbow trout and steelhead, they're part of a genus called Oncorhynchus, whereas Atlantic salmon and other like I believe brown trout and are part of a different salmon genus called Salmo. So they're pretty distantly related.
You. So Linda wanted to know if salmon would have historically reproduced in the creeks above Lake Merritt when it was better connected to the estuary.
It's definitely possible. As I mentioned earlier, Chinook salmon are typically spawning in large rivers, so it's unlikely that they were ever spawning in the creeks around Lake Merritt. It's possible that there were steelhead. There's a lot of steelhead runs in some of the tributaries to the bay, and so it's likely that there were steelhead that were spawning in the creeks above Lake Merritt.
Interesting. Yeah. We've never seen steelhead come in. It's really weird. Okay, so so Jim Covell had a question. He said a lot of fresh water in Oakland is supplied by the McCulney River, some of which might run down local drains. Could these salmon finding some trace of it in Lake Merritt water?
Oh, that's a pretty that's a fascinating question. Yeah, I haven't thought of that possibility, but that's yeah, that's definitely something that's worth looking into. So I think they're gonna be raised on or water at the hatchery from the McCollum River, so that is gonna be the water that they are accustomed to. So if the water chemistry is similar or has a similar scent, by the time it's pumped and used in Oakland, then potentially so.
A great question.
Hey,
Yeah, that's a great question. But
Katie,
Yeah,
I'd like to help with questions from the
please.
chat.
Yeah.
But let's see, in terms of tracking, if you could sort of time date where you're pulling from. Now, I can be sure I'm not, for example,
Well,
I've got Jerry Lips
yeah,
at
what?
7:48.
Okay, go for it. Would you like to read that out?
Sure. It seems that some of the detrimental aspects of hatcheries could be dealt with in positive ways, as you note, for some of them. How can Lake Merritt and its single remaining creek, Glen Echo, help with some of these problems?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there's in terms of how where the lake can fit in terms of the hatchery. I think maybe they're two unrelated things. So the fish that are the detrimental effects on the hatcheries would be maybe affecting the natural populations, and there's not any natural populations in Lake Merritt, but again, as I mentioned, Lake Merritt is part of the overall basin of the Central Valley. So fish are passing through the bay, and if the Lake Merritt is a healthy and but a good ecosystem with a lot of food and productivity happening, the lake could also be used by fish as a habitat. So I suppose in terms of the lake, how can the lake be helpful in terms of salmon is creating good habitat for all fish and for possibly for salmon to use, but also just a healthy ecosystem for the food and that salmon rely on too.
Do we have more questions? What are the reasons the tide gate opens and closes and who controls it? We have a question from Linda. And we have an answer from Paris, flood control and keeping the water in for recreation. Yeah, this has always been a little bit of a mystery, and because there's also maintenance and other reasons that they and cleaning is an important thing because the grates and the tide gates themselves actually get encrusted with marine life, and have to be cleaned off at least twice a year with divers going down and scrubbing off the incrustations. So it's exactly why is it's a little inscrutable. They're operated by the county flood control district. And it's something that we are privileged now to have a better handle on because of the work of the buoys and Lake Tech. They are able to show the periods of time when water level in Lake Merritt is rising and falling in a diurnal tidal pattern that we would expect, and then gives us a sense that we know when they're open or not. Emily, did you is that a big problem to salmon getting into tide gate controlled places?
Um, I guess I haven't really heard of any issues as much for adults. I know it's a problem for juveniles in with different tide gates. Depending on whether they're open and closed, they can get trapped in where through these gates. But yeah.
Anthony's asking if at the time that salmon start spawning and stop eating, does that cause their bodies to degrade and make them less attractive for consuming by others?
Yes, totally. It's a great question. So once fish start coming into fresh water, they start moving their energy from, maintaining a healthy body to reproduction. And so their meat quality actually really starts to go down by the time they reach fresh water. And so once they enter fresh water and start producing eggs and milk, their meat quality starts to go down. There's kind of some interesting history around that and the movement of harvest to the ocean. And so in the past, a lot of the salmon canneries were actually harvesting this spring run and winter run Chinook salmon, which were actually entering the river before they begin maturation. And so their meat quality was pretty good. And so the spring run and winter run were really the main target of harvest for the salmon canneries. And once their population started to decline, the fall run fish, when they come in, they're already ready to reproduce. So the fall run fish meat quality is a lot poorer by the time they come into the river. But this kind of coincided historically with the advent of motorized boats, and so this led to a lot of fishing moving from the river into the ocean. And so once fishing moved from the river to the ocean, they were able to harvest fish before they begin maturation, which led to higher meat quality as well.
Are you able to speak, and this question is from Josh, to the number of hatcheries in California and conservation hatcheries versus production hatcheries?
Yeah, so I think there's maybe roughly 5 or 6 hatcheries in the state that are production hatcheries. In the Central Valley. There's 4 of them. So and then there's one in the Central Valley that's a conservation hatchery. So that one is for winter run, which earlier I mentioned is a really imperiled, endangered population. There's a conservation hatchery there. And then elsewhere in California, there's also a conservation hatchery on the Russian River for endangered coho. And there's also a conservation hatchery in Santa Cruz for coho salmon there in Scotts Creek. So there's a couple of conservation hatcheries for coho salmon, especially since they're more endangered in California. But there's also one conservation hatchery for endangered winter run too.
Yeah, what would be a sense of the total number of hatcheries?
In total, I think in the States, in that map, there was maybe 9. There were 9 hatcheries for salmon.
I have a numbers question myself. If I'm at Lake Merritt and during the season that we just passed through and seeing perhaps a couple of hundred fish at most coming through, how many are passing through the bay trying to get to the delta?
Say that question again. I think that all of the fish, but
Well, so when you look at the numbers of salmon, well, we have a sense. We got 29 salmon we found and were able to retrieve. And then we got reports on other salmons, but again, we're in the hundreds, if not even didn't sound like as many as 1,000 being sighted. So, but we're just, those are the ones that came into the bay and ended up into Lake Merritt. What would be the numbers that we could think of as coming through the bay to get into those river basins?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, right now in the Central Valley, I think that the number of spawners that come back every year have ranged roughly between 50 to 100,000 fish. So that come back and spawn in all these different rivers, and a lot of them are hatchery origin. So maybe only a couple tens of thousand are naturally produced fish, and I would say like a very large component of them are hatchery origin. But the escapement numbers, or how many fish are coming back to spawn in the last few years, have roughly ranged between like 100 to or 50 to 60 to 120,000.
Is that coastwide, or that sounds like it's coastwide, not just through San Francisco Bay?
No, that's just through San Francisco Bay.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Emily, we had a question about are there any modifications to culverts that have been successfully used to allow salmon to cross through them to fresh water? I know this is a question that many of us who are at Lake Merritt have considered this, that it might be possible to do something to make it easier for fish to transverse culverts and get up to higher streams in like at Glen Echo.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I know I know a little bit about how to restore habitats, and especially for culverts to make fish accessible. But I'm not super familiar with the modifications. But I know that culverts, for example, they could be placed too high up so that fish have to jump, or only at certain flows. Maybe at really high flows, the culvert is moving too much water and the fish aren't able to swim past, or there's no water and the fish aren't able to swim past. So trying to make the culvert optimal and have the right amount of water flowing through the culvert so that fish can swim up, that's an important thing to consider. There's also the fact that culverts are, pretty slippery. They're pretty bare surface, and so typically when fish are jumping over waterfalls and other barriers, there's different rocks and things for fish to kind of have some sort of some sort of structure to hold on to, or lean on when they swim through it. And so I've seen people design culverts by putting gluing down rocks inside the culvert so that fish, when they jump up, they're not just sliding back down the culvert. So these are just some of the ways to make the culvert more friendly for fish passing through. But that's a really important question, and there's a whole field of restorationists and people that are really focused on trying to make these culverts accessible. So there's a lot more information than that on this.
You.
Would there be a fish that deserved or could receive restoring to Lake Merritt that existed, in the time before European arrival and settlement here, when it was a marshy area, and the salmon, or I'm sorry, the steelhead trout may have been making their way back and forth? Would there have been another fish that didn't really make its way back and forth, but was sort of more satisfied or native to the area, that restoration could be looked at?
Yeah, I need to think a little bit more about that. I'm not as familiar about the life cycle of other fish species, but I know that there are a couple of other important and listed species in the San Francisco Bay and the Delta area. So that includes Delta smelt, which are an endangered and nearly they haven't been found in the wild, so they're, kind of on the verge of extinction, and they are endemic, and they're only found in the Delta and the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm not completely sure if they go as far out into the Lake Merritt area or if historically they were ever there. But there's Delta smelt and there's also longfin smelt. These are two smelt species that are listed that are found in the Delta and the San Francisco Bay area that again, I'm not sure how far down they go and whether they are found in the area around Lake Merritt, but these are also two listed species that could really benefit from more careful management.
Thank you.
There have been reports of Chinook salmon turning up in other creeks around the bay where they haven't normally done so in the past. I know in the South Bay we were looking at some creeks down there that had a large representation, and there's there that is this do you think this is something that we're just noticing now, or do you have any reason why this could be happening at this time?
Yeah, I think that potentially, given that all these fish came from the same hatchery, I'm really curious whether there's just something about the release practices of the McCollum River hatchery that is leading them to stray. I read somewhere online as I was investigating this that the McCollum River hatchery has some of the highest stray rates of all the hatcheries in the area, and so maybe there's just as somebody mentioned with the water that's being used, or the fact that they're released, right across the bay in Sausalito, that could lead to this hatchery in particular having more strays in the area. Like I can't think of any reason why conditions wise they would be straying more to other places now than they were before. So and I also think it's just really interesting that they came from this hatchery in particular, given that there's a lot of other hatcheries in the area that are releasing tens of millions of fish, but they all came from this one particular hatchery. So I think I think that's probably the direction that I would look into more.
Thank you. And then Josh wants to know, is it possible that the tributary stream to Lake Merritt historically had a coho population? Probably be
that's a good question. I was thinking about that as I was talking about the steelhead. I am not aware of any coho populations that have been in the streams around the bay, and so I feel more confident with the steelhead, given that there are steelhead populations in tributaries of the bay. So in the South Bay, there's steelhead in Coyote Creek, and I'm trying to think what other creeks are down there. But there are steelhead populations in the tributaries of the bay, and there's not any coho. So, and I'm not aware of them being wiped out there. So, I'm not sure, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Katie, there's a question from Paris. Maybe we can make that.
Oh yeah,
question.
Yes, go ahead. In your opinion, are the salmon coming to try to and spawn? And if so, should something be done to help them do so? How realistic or feasible is it to make it a suitable place for them to go up one of the creeks from Paris?
Yeah, that's a great question. It does seem like these fish are coming up to spawn. It sounds like just talking to Katie about the conditions of these fish that these weren't particularly sick fish or anything. So it doesn't seem like these were fish that were dying and came into Lake Merritt. It seemed like some of these fish were in good condition, and the fact that they were hanging out closer to the arms of the lake near the freshwater sources suggests to me that they were looking for fresh water to spawn. Whether something should be done to help them do so, I think that's a question on like what's the goals here, because these fish are this isn't their native spawning habitat, and so is do we want Chinook salmon in these creeks? What's our overall goal is, and how realistic or feasible is it to have one of these creeks be a suitable place for them? I'm not super familiar with these creeks, but there's a lot of factors that need to be in place for a habitat to be a good spawning habitat. So it's not just any creek any source of fresh water is they need would work for salmon spawning habitat. They need gravel that's a specific size. So a specific size, it's not too big for females need to be able to dig their nest, and so the rocks need to be not too big so that they can dig, but also not too small, because really small sand and gravel can suffocate eggs. So they need to be a certain size of rock for the fish to lay their nest. There also needs to be cold temperatures and high flowing oxygenated water, or else the eggs need a lot of oxygen in order for them to be viable and for them to hatch. And then the other thing, in order for these habitats to be suitable, is for the juveniles. Once they hatch, these fish need an environment to grow, and so there needs to be food in the creeks for them to reach a good size. Because if they enter the ocean at too small of a size, it's very likely they'll just get eaten up right away when they head out to the ocean. So they also need the juvenile also needs space to grow, either in the creek or also in the estuary too.
I would like to add that Paris has been one of the people who has traveled up Saucil Creek and done some filming through the culverts, and so he knows the terrain quite a bit, and there's things that need to be done for sure. To even approach. There was also a study done in the 2000s by Swamp, looking at conditions of temperature, dissolved oxygen, and other factors in this particular creek. I think it was suggested that it might have been a Chinook habitat at one time, but I don't know if that's been followed up with any additional information. But I think one of the things that they were trying to see is if the conditions might support coho, and because that their tolerance ranges were mentioned against the different factors that were measured, and it didn't look like it would be a place where they could have their complete life cycle completed there. But it's certainly an intriguing thing, and wouldn't it be wonderful? We have such a wonderful lake to to be able to help salmon, if that did help them, or to at least be able to educate people by letting them see this kind of natural behavior.
Well,
Very
for
cool.
me,
Yes,
that actually
go for
begs
it.
the question.
Yeah.
In that Glen Echo area, there's a fair amount of space uh, that could be used. Could a possible small conservative hatchery be created there? Would that be a appropriate location or an ideal spot for something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure just because I guess it depends on the goals. Like, are the goals to establish a population there? I think I guess another important thing to think about is having enough habitat. So from what I understand, there's a pretty small stream area in Glen Echo for fish, and so there'd also need to be sufficient habitat too. But ultimately, like it depends on what the goal is. If the goal is to have fish in the stream or not.
Oh, that's a very good answer. I think it clarifies my question. Thank you.
I don't want to go on too long, but you had mentioned that there's artificial selection going on or evidence of that going on in hatcheries. And I was wondering what traits were being um, selected for or favored in those environments different from the natural environment.
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it is not intentional selection. So, but there is some artificial like that. There is some intentional selection, but one of the most common examples of artificial selection is when the hatchery has a quota of how many fish they want. So let's say like this season they're trying to get 100 adults to spawn, and so when the fish come back, they just pick the first 100 fish to come back, and they just once they got their fish, they just pick those, and for the rest of the fish that come back, they don't pick those. Then you are selecting for the early returning fish, and the time in which fish come back, whether they're the first arrival or the late arrival, there's a genetic component to that, and so over time that would lead to an earlier run timing of fish, and so they're aware of that now, and so most of the time at a lot of hatcheries, what they do is they have a sense of how long the season is, and they try to pick fish throughout the season. Another example of artificial selection is people picking the largest fish, and so if they choose the largest fish to spawn, then there's going to be a selection towards larger fish. This also happens in nature, though. The larger fish are the more attractive fish to other mates, though. So that kind of also does happen in nature. There's also selection and that happens for fish that come back too. Trying to think of what other cases of artificial selection that could be happening in the hatchery, but there's also the possibility that fish that are raised in the hatchery, because they're fed a really rich diet, they grow really quickly, and this leads to them to mature at a younger age. And so, if a fish is given a lot of food and it grows to a really big size, then it's ready to reproduce at a younger age. And so this leads to overall fish having a shorter life cycle, which could lead to a lot of like long-term consequences too.
Emily, we have just another few minutes before I believe our Zoom will allow us, but it's come to my attention, it's been brought to my attention that I neglected to allow individuals to unmute themselves as necessary and join the conversation. It was
Okay,
brought to me by Jerry
great.
Lips. And I've done that now. And Jerry, if you can
yeah, I would love to hear if people have any insight or
Ray, will it work for
ideas
you
on.
now?
Yes, thanks, David. Great.
Thank you. Sorry, everyone.
No, that's okay. I just put my questions in the chat.
Well,
If
in
you
that
would like
case,
to raise your hand if you'd like us to call on you and ask a question unmuted. Raise your hand. Addie has her hand raised. Would you like to unmute
Addie. See if you can unmute yourself, Addie.
Or type it into chat, I guess is the. Oh yeah, she can't unmute. Could you type your question into chat?
Let's see here.
There has to be a way of doing this here, right? With the, oops.
While
we've
she's
got the unmute yourself activated, so it should work.
Okay. Try again, please.
I just unmuted myself. So if you just go to the bottom, there should be a little like slash over your mute button where you should be able to click it and it'll take the mute button off.
Yes, that works.
Thank you.
Nice.
What a wonderful talk, Emily. I'm thinking, I went, I loved college. I was one of those people I just really took to school and education. But had I known that I'd have opportunities like this, I might not have gone to college at all. Go Bears.
Nice.
I did have a question. Has anybody looked at where Glen Echo dumps into the lake, if there's any obstacles to fish there? Because although there's not much water in the Glen Echo, I have walked along the whole thing and it's pretty open.
Well, let me start off with, if I can, with the novice answer, and that is that, there's a covert kind of a entrance there that's prohibitive for fish. And then once they get through, it's sort of a narrow, greatly affected and impacted environment.
You mean right under Grand Avenue?
Yes, right there.
Yeah, that's not a very big culvert, though.
Well, I would have thought a bigger culvert might have been easier to navigate, but I don't know. So someone else could take it from there.
If you look at the part of Glen Echo that's sort of over by the grocery outlet, it goes completely underground for quite a ways before it reemerges closer to the lake.
So, Emily, would they spawn in any part of the creek, or they'd have to get up into the higher reaches?
I think it depends on if the lower reaches have suitable gravel sizes, which I just saw somebody in the comment suggest that maybe there is, but also does it stay completely freshwater? Because the eggs can't really handle any salt water, so that's another factor. And I think another thing I wanted to mention is that the carcasses were recovered in the lake, but it's also possible that they moved upstream. And so a lot of times when people are recovering salmon carcasses, they find them quite downstream because once the fish dies, they get washed downstream. So it's possible that even though they were found in the lake, they had the ability to move and did move further up and through the culverts.
Yeah, I think somebody ought to go back up the culvert and carefully check for these kinds of things.
Yeah, you can also visually see a salmon what a salmon nest looks like. So typically rocks are covered in algae and are dark, but you can tell where a salmon has laid their nest because they dig up the rocks, so they turn over the rocks. So if you see a pile of clean looking turned over rocks, that usually is a sign that there's a salmon nest there.
Well, the other obstacle is that there are houses all along Glen Echo, and who knows what they dump into the creek.
Addie's ready to ask her question.
Yes. Thank you, Addie. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there's any way I could get the slides from tonight.
That's a question we could ask Emily if she would like to share them, for people who came to the program. We are recording, and the entire program will be available as a recording probably in about a week, and be posted on our playlist.
Okay, perfect. So where can I find the video recording too?
It will be on our playlist, and I'll send that out to everybody who is registered. If I got your email, then I will send you the recording link. Otherwise, you can also go to our playlist, which is on YouTube, and you can reach that from our website.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So it would be fascinating to take a closer look at Glen Echo Creek. It's people have been looking at it, but it is an urban creek. I know that, and a shout out to the children at St. Paul's School who have been studying water quality in Lake Merritt, and specifically in the creek at the Glen Echo outfall, and then going on up the creek, probably about a quarter mile. They've done water testing, and they've documented the tides go quite a ways into the creek at high tide. So it's salty water sometimes at that part that we can see most often. However, farther up, it's hard to say. And there's a creek walk with different structures, human infrastructure, and also places where you can actually look at the creek. And that is available on our website as well, and I will share that information with everybody here if you wanted to do a self-guided walk along the creek to see what it actually looks like. And there is a city park there called Oak Glen Park, which is quite lovely, and it is a regular city park. It could be looked at as to take a close look at the habitat there. Well, everybody, here we are. Emily, you have been so gracious with your time. I would like to I can't thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and just look forward to continuing the conversation and finding out more about the salmon of Lake Merritt. I can't leave without asking, is there any specific value in finding out where these particular salmon came from? Is that going to be useful to anyone? How would that be used?
Yeah, I think especially knowing like whether they are hatchery or natural origin is really important in terms of understanding like how much straying is happening naturally versus happening of hatchery origin. And so this is a big issue in the Central Valley just because of how many hatcheries there are, and these hatchery fish spawning and interbreeding with natural populations. So it would be interesting to know that if there is any natural origin fish, like how prevalent this straying is, and then if it turns out that all these other remaining fish came from the McCullomy River hatchery, that would also be really valuable in knowing that, because that's showing that these hatchery fish from this hatchery in particular is responsible for responsible for a high stray rates. And I think, and then on the other hand, just knowing the coded wire tags also provide a lot of information too.
One of the other things that I find attractive is that everybody seems to be interested in salmon. And we had crowds of people looking at what Katie was doing and participating in it. And there were newspaper articles and other things about it. It's a great attraction for Lake Merritt. We should take care of them.
Well, we were able to double down on that while it was happening and really share with a lot of people who had not much of an idea about salmon and their role in California's history and habitat. And so it was a wonderful opportunity. And yes, let's keep it going.
Absolutely. So I think it's time for us to say thank you to everybody who's here. Last chance if you want to say some last words, but let's all give a round of applause to Emily for a wonderful, wonderful evening and feeding our passion for our salmon of Lake Merritt and, you know, what they're doing here and what they say about us as stewards of the environment and California and what might be happening with global warming, all those questions, all focusing here. Anyway, I will thank you again so much, Emily, and look forward to.
Thank you, Emily.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great
Yeah,
job.
thank you for
Thanks.
having me and coming today, listening.
Yeah. Okay, everyone.
Thank you,
Let's have a
Katie.
wonderful, and if you have any questions, additional questions, you can send them to me and I'll, Emily, I'll send them on to Emily. And, you know, we'll keep the conversation going too. And I really appreciate everybody here tonight. Okay.
Night.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Have a great weekend. Okay, good night.
Good night.